Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Week 8 Sustainability, Business, and Entrepreneurship lecture, sponsored by the Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership and Transformational Change here at the Evergreen State College. It's my honor and my privilege to welcome our guest speaker this week, Rhys Roth. Rhys Roth is the Executive Director for the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure, or CSI, in Olympia, Washington, which is helping to bring innovation, new tools, sustainability, and sustainability excellence to infrastructure planning and investment in the Pacific Northwest. Rhys authored CSI's influential inaugural report, Infrastructure Crisis, Sustainable Solutions, and subsequent 3 reports in the 5 big goals for 2040, Rewiring the Northwest Energy Infrastructure, a Northwest Vision for 2040 Water Infrastructure, and From Waste Management to Clean Materials. And prior to founding CSI, Rhys co-founded and helped lead for over 15 years the nonprofit group Climate Solutions. He earned his BA and his MES degrees right here at the Evergreen State College. So welcome, Rhys. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Tamsin. I really appreciate it. And I like to say the Evergreen State College whenever we speak of the Evergreen State College. So, yeah. Okay. Well, I'm Rhys, and when the world was still young and fresh and new, ages and ages and ages ago, epochs, I went to the prestigious Evergreen State College, and I just had a fantastic life-changing experience, and it changed my life and the whole arc of my career. And I liked the undergrad so much, I stuck around and did graduate school in the MES program, the Master's in Environmental Studies program. And you know, I guess the real trajectory. So Tamsin suggested I should kind of go back to my Evergreen days and talk a little bit about that experience and how that shaped my career and direction. And so that's why I'm going back in time. And at any point, if folks want to jump in and comment on how your experience differed from mine, or if you have ideas or thoughts, just jump in. I don't know what the right way to do it is, but feel free to intervene, interrupt, and engage. So I welcome more of a conversation to the extent that we want to do that. But it was really in the master's program when the trajectory of my life work career took shape. And it was on a summer day. It was probably in July, and I piled in a little, I don't know if it was a Volkswagen Bug, but it was just a little tiny car. It was like 5 of us piled in, and we were driving down I-5 South to go climb Mount Adams. It's a gorgeous day. It was actually in June 1988. And we pull over for soda pop and chips or whatever we were consuming back then. And as we pull over, the in between the music, there was the news break. ABC News, blah, blah, blah. And Dr. James Hansen of the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies was testifying before Congress, and he said, this is when there was this huge drought going on, a kind of an unprecedented drought going on, where the Mississippi, like, ships were getting stranded and rails and were melting and kind of, you know, trains were derailing, and crazy stuff was happening, which you all are used to now, but then it was like, what the hell is going on here? And Dr. James Hansen says to Congress, we are 99% sure that the greenhouse effect is here. And the greenhouse effect is what back then we called global warming, climate change, climate disruption. And so that was like just the concept of some sort of environmental problem that would affect everything on the entire planet was pretty novel and pretty unnerving and big, obviously big as it gets. So right then I was like, I know what I'm going to do my master's thesis on, because we were all having to figure out like what's the topic going to be. So I went deep into that in the next 2 years. I didn't do any original scientific work on it. I just did a literature survey, but it was massive because there was a interdisciplinary renaissance going on in the science of global environmental change, where it started out with the atmospheric physicists like Dr. James Hansen, who, they're looking at like, they call it heat balance, but here's our planet, the sun, that ultraviolet radiation, it comes through the greenhouse gases, but on its way, when it's radiated back out at a lower temperature, longer wavelength, these gases, which are 1% of the atmosphere or less, have the ability to trap and hold the longer wave radiations, and so they're able to calculate when there's this much gas, here's how much heat will be trapped, and if you took away all those greenhouse gases, the Earth would be a frozen ball of ice. So they're actually really important. But they're able to calculate, if we increase that, if we double that, then this much more heat will be trapped. But then the question is, what does that do to life? How does that affect society? How does that change the behavior of climate on the Earth? And so then to build they had to build more complex models of the entire Earth system. And so they had to bring in the hydrologist who would say, okay, if we're trapping more heat, there's going to be more evaporation. What's going to happen to that in the atmospheric system and to weather systems if we do that? So they had to bring in the atmospheric hydrologist and the cloud experts, because clouds can, reflect away sun's energy. What if we increase clouds? Will we increase clouds? They had to bring in the forest ecologist, because obviously forests are a big carbon sucker and holder of carbon out of the atmosphere, which can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. But if you heat up the planet and disrupt forests, that could release carbon dioxide. Same with, they had to bring in the soil scientists. What's going to happen to soils? Will they respire and release more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere? They had to bring in the oceanographers. 2/3 of the planet's surface is ocean. And so oceans can pull heat and bring it down deep. And so will that sort of delay or prevent the atmosphere from warming? At the Gulf Stream, which makes Europe, significantly warmer than it would be without the Gulf. What if the Gulf Stream shuts down and stops bringing that heat to Europe? Where they're going to drop into an ice age? And so all these different scientists with different expertise had to come together and contribute into these big computer models that run these equations, and they run, projecting out 30, 40, 50 years if we increase the greenhouse gases by this much, all these consequences. So it was the ultimate evergreen, scientific challenge. It was just so incredibly interdisciplinary. And my thesis, I felt so sorry for my thesis advisors who had to read the like 2 drafts of this monster. It was like 287 pages. It was the longest like master's thesis of the MES program up till that point. But I finally got that done, and I just felt like coming out of that, I felt like, oh my God, this problem, this challenge, this threat, this threatens everything I care about in the world. It's like all of the natural world, all the people in the world, everything that I love and that we all love is vulnerable. And really, it's an existential threat, and seems really far off and long term, but it's like in my lifetime. So I was like, okay, that's what I got to do in life. And I for everything I got out of Evergreen, I got so much out of it. I did not get entrepreneurship and nonprofit management and financial management and fundraising and everything you've got to be able to do to develop and grow a nonprofit organization. So I had to kind of learn on the fly. And all I really brought to it was passion and maybe some decent strategic instincts, but it took quite a few years after I graduated to actually get the first grant for what became the organization that became Climate Solutions, where I could actually go to work every day on this problem. And then it was a number of years after that where we'd grown to the point that we could be hiring people who knew more than me, who had fundraising and management talent that could enable the organization to function and thrive. But it was a really cool journey in a lot of ways. One of I guess the most important early insight that I had, it just dawned on me that, you know what, like trying to influence this big beast by working from the upper left corner of the continental United States and this little region here, and a tiny small nonprofit, just, I mean, it is beyond David and Goliath. It was, trying to influence Washington, D.C. and federal policy is maybe not the smartest or most effective leverage point. The model that we all had in our heads for how this was going to go with climate change as the science became clearer was kind of like the immediate predecessor in terms of an actual problem that could affect the globe was ozone depletion. Is that do you guys ringing any bells? The problem of ozone depletion. So there's this shield in the stratosphere that filters out the deadly ultraviolet radiation, give you skin cancer and fry your eyes and damage plants and plankton and the kind of base of the ocean ecosystem. And it was observed that ozone shield was thinning out. It was the ozone was being broken apart up there in the stratosphere, particularly in the Antarctic, and that there was a hole in the ozone layer. And this was being caused, scientists were, Dr. Sherwood Rowland, it's discovered that it was these really persistent chemicals, but they're kind of a narrow class of chemicals. They're like refrigerants and propellants for like sprays, called chlorofluorocarbons, and they would not break apart. They would float all the way up to the atmosphere, and then they had some ability to break up ozone molecules up there in the stratosphere. So the science is really clear, the threat was clear, and at the UN level, all the nations of the world kind of came together, and most everybody agreed, we gotta ban these chemicals. We got to. And they were able to get there and do that and phase them out on a pretty rapid scale. So it's actually one of the incredible international cooperation success stories in that was successfully accomplished. And so that was the model that we had with global warming, climate change, greenhouse effect, is that science is becoming increasingly clear. The nations of the world will get together in these UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, these UN conferences, and negotiate how we're going to get rid of the the cause, tackle the cause, which was primarily the burning of fossil fuels. The problem is that compared to this narrow class of chemicals, chlorofluorocarbons, banning or phasing out fossil fuels, which was absolutely pervasive in the global economy and was probably the biggest industry on the planet. It's just a completely different scale of political challenge, political and economic challenge to phase out fossil fuels. And then, so I had the incredible privilege to get to go in 1997 to the Kyoto Convention, where out of which was this phenomenal thing where all the representatives of all the nations of the world come together, and there's NGOs and there's business and there's all kinds of other kind of lobby groups in there with the delegates, the representatives of nations. So you'd be sitting in this main hall, and up would come representatives of island nations, of big, huge, rich nations, of India, of every nation on earth. And there'd be a bank of translators who are, or interpreters, I guess. There'd be 7 of them. And then you would have your headphones and you could dial what language you speak. So obviously I was English, and then you would hear simultaneous interpretation of the speakers of all the nations of the world. And you would just run into people from nations you maybe even haven't heard of on the elevator. And it was just an incredible event. But out of that Kyoto Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol emerged, which is an agreement to begin to get our arms around this problem of the greenhouse effect, climate change. And almost immediately after that, there was a vote in the United States Senate, which would have to ratify a treaty. Any international treaty needs to be ratified by the US Senate for it to go into effect. And there was a vote to kind of test this proposition. And the resolution on the floor, I think, was no frickin' way are we ever gonna sign this treaty. And it passed 97-0, which was, that was a slap in the face to anybody who had hopes that we could get on top of this problem, and the United States would play a leadership role. It was just absolute punch in the gut, smack down to that whole notion. And the reason the vote was so wildly, terrible and uniform in its terribleness, 97-0, was because kind of an unprecedented coalition against any kind of action on climate change had come together to lobby, to fight this treaty, fight any kind of climate action that represented, it was all the major industrial trade associations in the United States. It was the chemical manufacturers, it was the auto manufacturers, it was the petroleum industry. They even had like the Farm Bureau. They had every sector that you can imagine, manufacturer association, et cetera, were all unified in something called the Global Climate Coalition, which was dedicated to fighting against any kind of climate action. So we're looking at that over here in the upper left corner, tiny, under-resourced, small nonprofit. I don't know that we're going to make a huge contribution to fighting the Global Climate Coalition directly in Washington, D.C. somehow. But so what we decided to do was instead take a regional approach and organize in the Pacific Northwest around the economic opportunity in leading the clean energy revolution, the transition from a fossil fuel powered economy to a clean energy economy. And so that was really kind of pretty novel take on this, but we didn't have a whole lot of fossil fuel production producer. We didn't have coal producer. We didn't have oil, in the Pacific Northwest. We were mostly importing that from elsewhere. So that's a net drain of money out of our region. And we'd led a lot of economic change and cultural change in the sense of like passenger aircraft, Boeing. That's where that started in the 1950s, the personal computer and software to run them, Microsoft, right here in the Pacific Northwest. Look at the changes that unleashed in the world. A lot of the early kind of cell phone stuff, Macaw Cellular and like up here in the Northwest. The manufacture at scale of computer chips and to being able to produce that at such a mass scale, and that the Moore's law came into effect where every, whatever it is, 2 years, there's a doubling of the capacity that can go onto the chip and the prices are constantly going down. That was really centered in Hillsboro, Oregon with Intel. Then you got things like gourmet coffee, which wasn't really a thing when I was growing up, and that sort of, Starbucks sort of swept the world with that. Microbrew, probably my favorite of all these. That started right here in the Pacific Northwest and now has swept the nation and even the world. So we can have an outsized impact on the global economy and society, and we've proven that. So why can't we do that on leading the way in the clean energy revolution? And so we have a lot of high-tech investors, high-tech entrepreneurs here. So we sort of pitched them on this. We formed, and I think the other insight was that given the array of forces against climate action, and their relentlessness, and the fact that we're so dependent as a nation and as a world on fossil fuels at this stage, we really can't just have a strategy that depends on one party or the other, so that, hey, this year we got 51%, let's pass a climate action law, and then the next year our team gets 49% and the other side has 51%, and they just reverse course. We really need to broaden this and to make it kind of motherhood apple pie, like everybody is pulling a little bit in the same direction here, and that we can have a shared vision. And so this idea of economic prosperity and environment and climate protection and transition going hand in hand was fundamental to trying to bust apart just it wasn't as partisan and polarized then as it is now, but it was. I mean, business and environment never went together. It was always jobs versus the economy, business versus environmentalist. You're already starting to see this rural versus urban divide where environment and agriculture were against each other. So we had a couple of programs, to accelerate this clean energy revolution. One was clean energy is the next high-tech revolution, where we're really trying to organize with the high-tech sector. Another was called Harvesting Clean Energy, where we would do these conferences that were very practical focused, like rural economic development through clean energy. That was something that, whether you were on the kind of the rural agriculture camp or you're on more of the environmentalist climate camp, it's hard to not just be like, yeah, we can all get behind rural economic development through clean energy. So really looking at how farmers and rural communities can develop renewable resources, implement energy efficiency in ways that are economically beneficial, create jobs and investment in rural communities. That was kind of the focus. That was the unifying vision. And we moved around between the 4 Northwest states, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, for this annual conference. Every year, we did it about 12 years running. And my first priority when we were going into a new state, one year ahead of time, was to form a steering committee that would guide the whole thing, plan all the tracks in the conferences, help recruit sponsors for it, and do all the publicity and outreach. But the first order of business was to get the Farm Bureau of that state on board and on the steering committee. If you can get the Farm Bureau on that state, then every other rural organization in the state is like, oh, the Farm Bureau is involved. Okay, heck yeah, we're in. And we were able to get all the other agriculture organizations and the rural economic development organizations and everybody else. And it was much easier for us to get the clean energy and kind of agencies and nonprofits on the steering committee. So we always started with the hard one, and that kind of unlocked everything. So we would move around and we had incredible turnout. We would have real tons of farmers. It was just one of the coolest mixes of people who were actually working lands people, farmers, etc., and agency people and NGO people and entrepreneurs and investors that all came and mixed it up at this annual conference. It was very practically oriented. We'd always have the governor and probably one of the senators from whatever state we're in, whether it was a blue state or a red state, they would come because of all the people involved in the steering committee and the interests involved. And so in that sense, we're trying to take this whole issue out of the partisan warfare and elevate it into a place where we can all agree that rural economic development through clean energy is good. How can we make that happen? What are the barriers? How do we overcome them? How can we invest in this direction that we all kind of can agree on? That's been, for me, that's been a real focus in continually trying to bridge these divides, these cultural, partisan, political, geographic divides, to find kind of common cause around the transformations that we need to get to a sustainable society and to get to a place where we can solve this climate crisis. About 7 years ago, Climate Solutions had grown to 25 staff or so and was thriving and cooking along pretty good. And I was starting to itch to do something new. Ended up starting a public service center at the prestigious Evergreen State College called the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure. And the focus there is on helping infrastructure decision makers who are spending, just in the Pacific Northwest, just in Oregon, Washington, spending billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars every year to operate, maintain, and rebuild and expand our infrastructure systems. So our energy systems, our water systems, our waste management and transportation systems, these systems that are a lot of times either publicly owned and managed or publicly regulated and that we're all paying into, and they're vital. We pretty much can't live our lives without functioning infrastructure systems like these. But a lot of the decisions about how we spend billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, of our dollars, on these systems every year, they're being made by really capable, smart, well-trained civil engineers who are in their 60s and 70s, almost all dudes, who were trained in a playbook from like the 1970s and 1980s. That's when they were young. That's when they got their training. That's when, and so these systems have been managed with a 70s and 80s paradigm and manual. And they're really, there's so much technological advancement, there's so much best practices advancement, there's so much more potential for innovation to get much more triple bottom line, community value, economic, financial value, and greater environmental performance, social equity. We can do tremendous things, but those investment decisions are being led really by these senior end of career folks trained in the old manual. And it's a little bit like a priesthood where the experts in the utility, in the agencies, who know what they're doing, are making the decisions, even though it's going to affect our quality of life and everybody, and we're all paying for it. There's not a lot of engagement with community and with stakeholders and with all the folks who are going to be affected by these investment decisions. So Center for Sustainable Infrastructure exists to help infrastructure decision makers kind of open up the lens, open up and step back from just conventional strategies. This is the way we've always been doing it, so we're just going to keep doing it that way, and really consider innovative, integrated, interdisciplinary, value maximizing, triple bottom line kind of approaches and strategies for spending billions and billions and billions of dollars. And so I guess maybe I want to transition to kind of open it up to discussion. I'll just cite one, maybe riff for a couple minutes on one thrust of our work in recent years, which kind of echoes back to this bridge building discussion that has always been very important to me. But we somehow got involved in bringing people from Washington and more recently Oregon on tours in Denmark to see the incredibly cool sustainable infrastructure and clean industry projects that they have there and their practices. And over the course of 2017, 2018, 2019, we went on 3 trips where we brought 26 Washington state legislators on these tours in Denmark, and 13 of them were Republican, 13 of them were Democrats, from all over the state, wide, from the tiny small town kind of districts to the big cities, South Seattle, where they speak 140 different languages, all and everything in between. And you'd think, oh, this could just be, 1 week of solid, like bickering and arguing but as it turns out, the Danes are just so gall darn down to earth and practical, and the Republicans kind of went in going, Denmark, those guys are like socialists, right? And so they kind of had their skepticism up, but they're not putting their ideology on anyone.
I think we might have lost your audio, Rhys. Can everyone else hear Rhys? Oh, okay. I lost mine. Go ahead.
Okay. Still can't hear me?
Yeah, you're good. Sorry. It must've been my computer.
Okay. So anyways, the Danes were just so down to earth. They weren't, trying to convince anybody that their ideology or system is the best. They would just say, here's the project, here's how it works. This is how we do it. This is why we do it this way. It really makes sense to us. And do you have any questions? And people would look at that, particularly around this idea of industrial symbiosis, where the waste from one industry or sector becomes a resource for another, and they're circulating and recycling or organic waste, energy waste, and thermal energy. They're incredibly good at that. Wastewater, and getting optimal, maximal use of it. So you get incredible economic value from that, and you get incredible environmental gains and greenhouse gas emission reductions. And their systems are operated just really efficiently and clean, and they all have a really good business case. And so their companies are really effective and successful. So the Republicans are kind of like, they saw that, and they think about their district, and the Democrats too, about the industrial districts where they live, and like, wow, I can see how we could apply this kind of approach in my district, and that could really bring a lot of benefits. And so they came back, and they've collaborated over the last 5 years, every legislative session, in passing, if you can believe it, industrial symbiosis legislation, first study bills, and then in 2020 they passed the nation's first statewide industrial symbiosis program that would provide funding, competitive grant funding, for communities to kind of develop their industrial symbiosis opportunities. And they passed it like at every stage in the House, all the different committees, every level, on the Senate side, unanimously, all the Republicans, all the Democrats. Yep. And then when it passed off the Senate floor and finally was sent to the governor in 2020, in the week between passage and his signing, COVID hit, opened up a huge hole in the budget, and the governor had to veto every bill that had any funding associated with it. And so we were like, oh my God, oh, that's devastating. But then this that we call them the Denmark Coalition, all these Republicans and Democrats who are really having fun working together on something positive. It's just, they don't get to do that all the time. So it's kind of cool. But they came back in 2021, did the whole thing over again, passed every stage, and this time sent it to the governor, signed it, and Washington became the nation with the first industrial symbiosis program. 2022, they quadrupled the funding for it, and they sent $500,000 to Washington State University to partner with a nonprofit organization based in Olympia, Washington, that focuses on sustainable infrastructure solutions. And so we're actually selected among that whole pool of potential candidates to work with them on that, on a report on making recommendations on how we can stand up an agriculture symbiosis cluster and sector in Washington State, where we apply industrial symbiosis principles to the agriculture sector throughout the state. So it's been a kind of a cool thing. And this past year, we've actually run a clean industry knowledge exchange between the city of Portland and Denmark, where we brought a group of industry leaders and government leaders and NGO and environmental justice leaders on this same tour of Denmark to see what they're doing there around clean industry. And then a delegation of Danes coming here to help support Portland to develop a clean industry innovation hub that creates inclusive, high quality family wage jobs and develops a thriving clean industry sector. So this idea of clean industry, I think, has a lot of, which is weird, because when I was at Evergreen, I just assumed that industry is evil and is the problem, and that's the cause of all our problems, and industry is inherently bad. And now industry is, in some ways, like key to solving this whole crisis, is to help them transition to carbon-free and clean ways of producing this stuff in our economy. Anyway, I'll stop rambling on there and just, Tamsin, how do you?
Yeah, I can. Well, first, let's go ahead and pause and just thank you so much for taking us through your journey and the work, very important work that you and your organization have done in the past and are doing now and will continue to do in the future. So if we could just take a moment, claps, snaps, thanks in the chat. Yeah, hands.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and I've got my own questions, but those can wait. So I'm going to open the floor to questions.
how do we do it? Do Tamsin, do you call on people, or Kathleen, or do people just speak
Yeah,
up, or what's
so
the-
we've done it many ways. Folks can post their questions in the chat. They can raise their hands. This is more sort of an informal space today, so you can also just unmute. And then Kathleen and I will just keep an eye on hands raised and stuff in the chat, because I know it can be challenging to navigate multiple windows in Zoom. Any questions? Yeah, Chris, I see you unmuted. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. This might be too deep of a dive, but I'm just curious what the kind of overall, what it looks like in this project you were just talking about in the agriculture sector. Like, what are some of the kind of big ideas there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that we see in Denmark is really, really good at, that we haven't figured out and done much with, is the capture of waste heat. And so I'll use an urban example, but this can apply to all sorts of agriculture sector businesses and industries. But one of the industries that we brought on this Portland tour to Denmark is a major steel manufacturer. And I got to tour their facility. It's absolutely mind-blowing, but they have like 17-inch thick, or, a foot thick and, as wide as my kitchen here, slabs of steel. I think they weigh 17 tons, that they have to heat up uniformly all the way through the center to 2,240 degrees Fahrenheit. And then in this furnace, and then in order to be able to then take these giant rollers and roll them into, this thin, so that then they can become the cladding on, around a wind turbine. That's one of their big markets. And so there's actually a lot of kind of things that are part of the clean energy revolution that they're producing out of this crazy factory. But they got to use fossil natural gas for this furnace. But so, we're trying to figure out, can hydrogen, or is there a carbon-free way to apply that amount of heat effectively? But in the meantime, when we had the Danes tour with us, they're like, oh, what's the temperature? Are you capturing that waste heat that's coming off that furnace? And they're like, well, no, it's coming up. It's just venting to the atmosphere at about 600 to 700 degrees Fahrenheit. And right next door is this preheat box. Before it goes in the main furnace, they heat those slabs up to 200 or 300 degrees. And so the Danes are like, well, if we could just like capture that waste heat coming off the top and pipe it over to the preheat box, you might even have waste heat off of that. But you could, that was their second biggest source of, or use of natural gas, is the preheat box. So you might be able to just eliminate all that right there. And that kind of piping of capturing of waste heat, the technology is really mature and proven. And then piping it to a thermal use, a use of heat, that's pretty pervasive in Denmark, and we're not doing any of it. And there's all kinds of and you can form thermal loops where you can, if you need to cool, you pull heat through heat exchange technology, you pull heat out of a space, and you can pump it into you can take that waste heat and pump it into your thermal loop, this pipe that kind of circulates. And then if you need heat, you can pull it out. So you can have multiple straws dipped into this loop that can, if they want to cool, they dump the heat in. If they want to heat, they pull the heat out. And it's all, minimizes the energy inputs from the outside by maximizing and optimizing the use of energy. So if we can do that in a town like Quincy, where there's multiple food processors who have, have lots of hot water kind of applications, and there's also multiple refrigerated storage facilities who can pull heat out to refrigerate and dump that into the system. You have data centers in proximity that need to cool down the data centers, so they they could be dumping the heat from the water that they're circulating as they're cooling and putting that into a thermal loop. That's just an example of agriculture symbiosis. Sorry, Chris, does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question if there's not anyone else itching to ask the question. Rhys, I wonder if you could speak to in your work. I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question. It seems like a lot of this work in industry, and particularly, requires sort of the big guys, right, that have a lot of capital to invest in research and tech and changing these systems. And I wonder if you could talk more about perhaps the role of micro / small / medium-sized enterprises, either in industry or beyond, in engaging in this work in really meaningful ways that make a big impact as well.
Mm-hmm.
Does my question make sense?
Yeah. And I mentioned Lisa Smith to you the other day when we were chatting, who is the president of the Washington Micro Business Enterprise Association. I might be getting the name wrong, and a nonprofit called Enterprise for Equity. And she could really answer your question way better than me, because she thinks about it every single day as how the startups, micro enterprises can engage in this great revolution. So there's really so much to be done, and so many unrealized opportunities that I really think that it feels to me like part of the big part of the challenge is just to help people realize that they can be heroes in this great challenge of ours, and that they and particularly for I guess people in industry who are not used to seeing themselves as climate warriors or agents of a environmental revolution, for them to actually see that they have an incredibly important role to play, and it's their know-how and intelligence and creativity that can make a huge difference, and it's fun and it's cool, and you'll probably make money. Getting everybody working in the same direction on this is a real imperative. At the smaller company level, like, entrepreneurship is incredibly important. Just like, the thing about the economy is incredibly diverse. So there's so many opportunities in here, but sort of scaling just this waste heat opportunity, like, who are the companies that are really specializing in knowing how to do that? So the steel company, their expertise is centered on their product and how to do that properly and right. So they don't have the expertise to build the system to capture the waste heat and move it over to the preheat box. But a startup or a repositioning HVAC firm can do that kind of thing. So there's 1,000 examples like that where you need a company from the outside who brings the expertise to do the thing that's like a no-brainer if somebody can just handle it and figure out how to, all the challenges there, and make it really easy for the business or industry to say, yeah, heck yeah, why not?
Awesome, thank you. Are you able to hang around with us for a few more minutes after 2, or do you have to get going?
I can hang out till 5 after.
Okay, I will take that. Thank you.
I'm gonna go play pickleball in the sunshine. So
so I'm going to ask, there's a question in the chat, and then I'm going to hand it, Kathleen has a sort of a follow-up question, but I do want to get to this one. Student asks, what are the reasons why a project that makes economic sense for example, lower capitalization, lower customer costs, would not be supported by businesses and consumers. I'm going to assume, and Jonathan, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that that's within the context of like, more efficient technology or optimization, like you've been talking about, et cetera.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's interesting because not to keep going back to the same example, but I was just talking last week with this steel company, and they're actually doing an engineering analysis of how they can do this waste heat capture project, and so that it's kind of a high level business case to say, yes, technically feasible. Here's kind of the capital investment that would be required. Here's how much we would save in natural gas costs, and if all that looks like, yeah, wow, then they can go to a deeper level of, kind of feasibility engineering, how actual design. But then that gets fed into, at the kind of the executive level. We've got these 61 capital investments that we're looking at across our enterprises, that are, these are complex facilities that have so many moving parts, and all of them are wear down and need replacement. And so they've got to, they can't do them all 61. They got to like prioritize and sequence. And so if this project that makes total economic sense, but maybe has a 5-year payback, but this other one is absolutely mission critical. If we don't fix that one, roller, our whole operation could shut down, and we can't shut down. We're operating on 3 shifts, 24/7, and so that one's mission critical. This one is optional, and so unless it's sometimes it's just hard to even projects that make great economic sense to get to the level of yes. It can help if with the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's a lot of funding for these kinds of projects in there, and if we can help them land federal dollars that can knock off 25% of the cost, or if they act now, blah blah blah, that can help to elevate it on the priority list.
Awesome, thank you. Kathleen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that was great. Thank you. I think this is a follow-up maybe to Jonathan's question. So you were just talking about those projects that make great economic sense, or that can be made to make great economic sense if you put the right incentives in place, for example. And I'm interested in the role of, for example, international accords, or I'm thinking about like policy level, we could do regional policy. We talked about state stuff. You talked about national, and then international agreements. But of course, there's this sort of movement of global capital that in my program we're talking a lot about. And it means that if a region becomes sort of too hostile to cheap production, then you might get a withdrawal of capital from that region, and it just goes to a now newly attractive low regulation zone somewhere else in the world. So I'm just curious if you had either examples of like places where, or industries that are particularly prone to that, or counter examples like, okay, that happens sometimes, and here's what people do to combat it. So does that make sense as a question? I think it's a version of everything you've been talking about, but I'm just sort of thinking at the very big meta level.
Oh yeah, I mean, we've been thinking a lot about that lately. In Oregon, metals manufacturing is a big deal, and Portland just lost one of their major metal manufacturers, just because kind of the regulatory environment and the kind of taxes that are being imposed, and Portland actually considered imposing a carbon tax on their industry, that would have raised costs and may or may not have, reduced their emissions. But and what's interesting is that Oregon and I'll circle back to you, but Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has done pioneering work in terms of understanding the life cycle, full suite of carbon footprint from a life cycle perspective, meaning so the current way that we, as a state, at state level, I think is easy to understand. The current way that we try to measure and then manage and ramp down greenhouse gas emissions, climate pollution, is by adding together all the emission sources, point sources, smokestacks, tailpipes, etc., within the state's border, within what happens within our state border. That's all we have control of. And so we're regulating that, and we want to. If we're successful, that number is going down, 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 down. What Oregon DEQ did was say, well, that's actually doesn't tell the whole story. As Oregonians, our climate footprint is really in part that, but also the greenhouse gas emission pollution that is embedded in all the products that we buy and consume in a given year, no matter where they're produced. So to add that up, we're going to look at like everything that we buy in Oregon and trace it back from when it gets extracted out of the fuel gets extracted, the material gets extracted out of the earth, the processing, the transportation, the fabrication, the delivery. All those emissions are part of our footprint. And when they did that, they found that about half of Oregonians' climate footprint is hidden and is outside of that border-based inventory. So it was a consumption-based inventory. And then when you start to realize that, then it's like, well, geez, so if we're trying to bring down, all we care about is bringing down pollution in our state border, we could raise costs on a producer and the industry here in such a way to drive them to another place, or make them less competitive with producers in other countries who are much dirtier. And the net result of that, it'll look like we're reducing climate pollution in our state, but we're actually increasing climate pollution in the globe, which is a huge problem. And our climate policy is not designed. It's kind of a perverse effect that can come from the way that we're regulating climate pollution right now.
Awesome. All right. Well, we don't want to keep you, Rhys. Once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, it's really awesome, I think, for us to have listened to lectures on sort of more of the smaller scale, individual enterprises or whatever. And now, you come and sort of give us this overarching systems perspective. And then our last session our last guest session in the week 10 will also provide that. So thank you again, everyone. Thanks.
Hey, and thank you. It's a thrill to talk with you. And I appreciate everybody who I can see. And I hope someday we can meet in person.
Yes. You and I will connect about perhaps thinking about doing more hybrid formats of these in the future. So we'll see if we can arrange another session. So thank you.
All right. Take care.
Awesome.